So one of the things I thought was kind of an interesting piece that I wanted to make sure we highlighted was how do all of these various news outlets figure out exactly what to put on their front page or at the top of their news story? How do they determine of all of the events, what literally, and I'm not making this up as a statistic, 1% of all of that is actually going to get covered? Because there's a lot of things going on in the world that are important. How is it that the news tends to focus on a certain number of stories, that agenda setting that we talked about so early in the semester? Well, there are a couple of different ways that these news producers decide. And one of the most important ways is this idea of newsworthiness. All right. And there are tons of lists out there. I've got an image on the bottom of your screen here that you can see if you look right here that has some factors. I'm going to go over the ones that I learned when I was in school that I think are still really important. And I think it shows both the strength and the importance of the news, but also some weaknesses in using these criteria. So the first one is timeliness. Obviously, we call it the news because it's new, because it's what's going on. If you go on to any major news outlet right now, it's going to be top front and center. It's going to be the coronavirus. That's going to be the thing that you're going to see. And as a matter of fact, if I kind of split my screen here, I'm going to show you, I'm going to go to CNN just because it's, a very generic website. And I'm going to split this here so that you can see the criteria on one screen and hopefully, if I'm doing this right, and the criteria on one screen and an actual panel on the other. So when we look at this, timeliness is important. Right now, everything at the top here is about the coronavirus because that is what everyone is talking about and that's what is concerning to a lot of people. So in a way, this makes sense. That's what the news is all about. However, there are other stories going on besides just the coronavirus. And a lot of times, because we have this 24-hour news cycle, a lot of times there are really important stories that don't get shown because, they're no longer new and we don't have any new developments and there's nothing else that we can really put into, there's nothing really else that we can put into it. For example, Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. It's been a really long time and we still haven't solved that problem. However, because there are no new developments, the story fizzled out. Another key issue is importance, and again, if you come here onto the CNN page, you can kind of see, virus hunters zero in on possible culprit, U.S. virus deaths, all of these things. And of course, there's, some advertisements and things like this. But, they're things that we think are going to be the most important to the people who read and view this site. If we go to another site, like let's go to the BBC. And you're going to see me do this a couple, whoa, big blue cousins. That is definitely not what I wanted. There we go. Sorry about that. As you can see, if we go to Europe, there are different stories that are important to, to Britons and to people who are in the BBC viewership. So importance is very rarely going to be about what the reporter feels is important. It's going to far more be what they think viewers want to see. Proximity. And this, again, if you look at the difference between CNN and the BBC, obviously the fact that Boris Johnson, their prime minister, is in the hospital is going to be more important to them because that's somebody who is in their government. Now, granted, it is still on the page. I believe here it is right here. So it's still something that we consider important, but it's not as proximal. As a matter of fact, today I was going through Twitter, and there was a story from a reporter named Ellie Chen who works for NPR in St. Louis, and she was looking for a St. Louis person or people who had been who are immune compromised, whose families are having to struggle. And so I think that kind of just goes to show this desire of what we call localization of a story. And if we go to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, You can tell I was looking at things for your class today. If we go to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, you're going to see that, again, here's the Missouri law, stuff about Missouri lawmakers, and, the city leases former North St. Louis nursing home to shelter the homeless. You're going to see that while we still have coronavirus stories, we also have how it is affecting St. Louisans specifically. All right. So you're really going to see, when you look at newsworthiness overall, this kind of blending, especially of these first few. All right. Now, if we look again into interest can be, a lot of times you'll hear this as human interest stories. Things that are kind of just cool will often go in here. For example, when I was working for the YMCA, we had this huge balloon release. This is back before, we knew that the balloons were really bad for the environment. And I had about 500 kids in these really great shirts and things, and they were going to be lifting these balloons off to celebrate something. I don't remember. But I had 2 or 3 news outlets come out to cover that because it was interesting to look at. Sometimes interest, that's cool, is going to actually get their attention, but it's almost always going to be an after weather segment or further down the road. Celebrity or prominence. If someone goes to the hospital for coronavirus, they're probably not going to cover it on the news. When Tom Hanks went to quarantine, he was on the news. And that's because he has a certain amount of celebrity. When we know somebody or when we have a prominent person, that's going to be someone who's going to get covered. Impact, how does this affect the individual? And again, I think if we go back and look at coronavirus again here, you can really see that the reason that this is being covered so much is because it is something that affects people. If you go over to the business section, the stories covered here are going to be more focused on how that's going to impact people who are involved in business. And yet we often do still get coverage of business in the main news because how the markets behave do affect us. They affect it affects our lives. It affects a lot of other things. So, oops, too far. Oddity, these are your weird stories. I actually just finished listening to a story for a class that I'm in about, it's called 3 Identical Strangers, and it's about 3 triplets who were separated at birth and their life story. Well, that's newsworthy because it's odd. It's different. Usually Oddity is going to sell. And this is actually kind of a good thing when you think about violence and news, because a lot of people are like, oh gosh, I don't like, the news is so focused on the negative. Well, luckily, the negative, these bad things happening to us are odd. The vast majority of us are going to get up in normal times, go to work, go to school, and come home, and nothing is going to happen, and it's not newsworthy. If a murder happens, or if, some sort of violent crime happens, that is odd. It's, it doesn't happen to us every day, thank goodness. And that's one of the reasons why it's, going to be covered in the news. Conflict, when there's drama, this is why scandals and political fights and things like that get involved. And also with conflict, anytime there's going to be a stress between the government and the people, or 2 different branches of government, or criticism of somebody, that's also going to make the news because people think it's A, important, and B, it's drama. It's interesting to watch. And the last one is currency. And currency and timeliness are hard to kind of grok or get your head around. Timeliness is it's happening right now. Currency is this story is time has come. So for example, the idea that people are making like tutorials on how to make masks might be a currency. Or I might have ideas on how to keep your children interested when they're stuck inside. Might be a currency thing. And that's just because it's not dire importance, but it is related to what's going on. Sometimes, you just kind of see that. I'm looking down at the other side of this, where there's just all kinds of other things that are, that can determine whether or not something is newsworthy. And I hope that kind of helps you understand those main concepts. All right. See you in the next video.